All right, so today we're going to talk about iterative design. We're going to talk about it as a strategy to help you move through and create your own projects. Essentially what it is a process, and it's a process that is incremental and gradual, and it's small steps that are done over time, and this allows for input and change throughout the entire design process. So right now it's probably daunting as you open up processing. There's a white screen like the one you're looking at right now. And the question is, well, where do you start? Okay, so we're going to talk about going over a strategy to help, some of the foundations and fundamentals of that, and then we're going to look at an example of this in practice. So starting off, you usually have an idea. It's either an assignment that I've given you that has parameters, or you have your own thing that you want to come up with. So for an example, I was giving my kids a bath, and I'm looking at a bathtub full of bubbles, and I want to make a pattern or a design that is essentially a density of circles. So there's my idea that I'm starting with. So how do I get from an idea to code? Well, I have to take this idea and I have to abstract it in a way. I need to start getting towards rules or a procedure in order to start making code for it. So this abstraction is fundamental. It's something that's really important, and it's a way of thinking of moving from an idea stage into a practice stage. So one of the things I know in our examples here is that I'm looking at this, the circles are going to have to be of different sizes so they don't intersect. So essentially that the circles fill in the space around them by changing sides. So they're going to need to know what is in their neighborhood, what's going on around them. So they're going to have to be aware of these things. Okay? So I take from my abstraction, I'm going to start trying to create some rules or an algorithm, a process or a procedure in order to start making this happen. So a few things in a step-by-step process. The first thing I want to do is that I'm going to generate a new circle, and I'm going to put that circle onto the screen. And now I need to look. It needs to be aware. So does it intersect with another circle? Right? It has to know what its neighbors are doing. If it's not intersecting, then we're going to draw it as big as possible, and we can set limits, a max and a minimum size that we're willing to use for this. If we make it so big that it fills up the screen, the next one that comes won't have any space to move. So we're going to have a limit on it. And so once it checks, if it doesn't have an intersection, build it until it does reach the edge of something else. If it gets put onto the screen and it does intersect, then we got to start all over. We got to find another spot to go to. Okay, so these are my general sort of rules or process that I'm going to help build this code. Okay, so now we have to formalize this logic, and this is where we start looking at code structures. So we've talked about variables, we're talking about if-else statements, we're talking about loops. Okay, so are there areas of repetition in this idea? Yes. Is there randomness? How do I start? What are the different parameters that I'm going to use? So I'm looking at my code tools and how I can apply this algorithm or these rules into the structure of code itself. Okay, so then I start building some source code. All right, and so for this is perhaps a little confusing, but you've seen this. It's a for loop. I'm initializing a variable. I'm keeping track of it as how many bubbles or circles I've already drone to the screen, and I'm going to cycle through all of those, and I'm looking for a distance. So the float d is a distance between where's this new circle that I'm putting compared to where are all the other existing circles that are already drawn to the screen. And if it doesn't intersect, then we're going to draw the circle, okay? And we're going to add it to the list of all the circles that are onto the screen. Okay? So you can see this. There's a code structure here. There's a for loop. There's an if statement. There's some updates. There's some variable initializing, and so this definitely looks like code. Okay? Now the computer, of course, takes this code and it's going to interpret it, and it's going to create an image or a simulation depending on what the project is. So here is just a little example of here are all the bubbles being built to the screen. Now, part of the iterative side to this is that once we have this image, as the designer, we come into the process and we are looking and evaluating it. So, do I want to make changes? Did something not work? Do I need to go back to the source code and make changes? Maybe there was something wrong in the structure or the logic wasn't quite right. Or maybe I have to go all the way back to the rules themselves. Do I have to expand upon those? Do I have to make changes on those to help create this design? Okay, so here is an example then that we'll go through, kind of taking this idea of idea abstraction. We're going to generate a little bit of an algorithm with it and try to create some source code. So here is a pattern that I found. It's of it's like a grate, like a storm grate on the street. And what I'm noticing with this pattern is that it's a grid. And with our nested for loops, we know how to make grids. The other thing I'm noticing is that the lines, they alternate direction in each row. So in one row they go in one direction, and then in the next row they go into the opposite direction. They sort of make this crisscrossing. So that's sort of my idea. I want to create this, a little bit of my abstraction, and I'm thinking of terms of the algorithm is that I want to find out if the line is even, then I'm going to draw a line in one direction. If it's odd, I'm going to draw it in the other. So I'm going to need to find out the angles. I'm going to need to find out spacing, and those are going to be sort of the more difficult things to figure out. So when we get into our code, that's the things we're going to try to start figuring out. So let's see if we can do this. So one of the things with code that we forget about sometimes is that you can actually start with pen and paper and start sketching out your ideas. So here I'm trying to figure out the pattern. I'm trying to figure out the spacing. I know I want my lines, the odd lines, to start in one direction and the even to go in the opposite. And I'm trying to figure out the spacing, and I'm realizing that there's this, they kind of meet halfway. So if I have a grid and I'm drawing lines that are half of that size, I'm going to start being able to line the pattern up. Now I'm going to have to figure out angles, but it looks essentially like about a 45-degree angle just to kind of start it. But depending on the box size, it should be fairly easy to figure that out. All right, so here's my first attempt at it. So we'll kind of go through this code here, and I'll show you what I'm thinking. So the first thing I do, I know that I'm making this grid. So in this grid, I'm just making some spacing. So I have some variables that I'm initializing here, and I'm just making my grids a 40 by 40 pixel box in a sense. Sort of arbitrary for now, but that's sort of the size I'm going with, just so the math is easy here with the size of the window. So I have it 400, 400. I have the anti-aliasing on with the smooth. Now what I've done is I've actually broken this down into two nested for loops. So one segment, one block, I guess, of this nested for loops is going to do this left to right. If I could spell leaning line, so it's going to go from the bottom kind of to the top. So I'm drawing that, and then I've created another block of code that's going to create the lines going in the other direction. And just to try to start figuring out spacing, and you'll see here, so the first, in this for loop, to break this down again, I'm starting it at 40, which is essentially the grid spacing. I'm going to update this loop as long as y is less than or equal to the height minus the vertical grid spacing, and I'm going to continually update it by that grid spacing as well. I'm doing the same thing here in the horizontal or x axis, starting at 40, measuring it as long as it's the width minus that block, and updating it by that same value. Okay? And so I'm creating a line in that box. So I'm starting at that initial position, and I'm just adding 20 to it. So it's going to go 20 pixels to the right, so essentially half the box. And then it's going to go up because the y here is in a negative, so it's going to subtract itself, and it's going to go up, so kind of left to right. So where things got weird, and we'll see this once once we compile it here. For the other line, things start out fine. Things are very similar here. It's the 40. I had to kind of tweak this number, for the X portion, that second for loop, the nested for loop. Only to get the spacing. So the thing I noticed in the design is for these lines to line up, for them to be kind of close to each other to create that sort of T pattern. I needed to make adjustments with that. Now similarly, I'm starting here, X and Y, I'm going over to the right 20, but here I'm going to then go down. I'm going in a positive direction in the Y-axis, and that's going to create the line going in the opposite direction. So when I compile this, I get a pretty nice structure. It seems pretty even, pretty lined out. So in here, we can see that these are kind of lining up to the center, that are also lining up to the center here, and that these lines are staying consistent. So these are the things I was looking for in the design of measuring this out. So in a way, this definitely looks like that metal texture that we were trying to create. So now even, let me close this down. If I adjust this size, I should hopefully still get something similar. It might fall off the screen, but let's see. Let me adjust my window size. And sure enough, yep, I still got it pretty well contained here. So I can make this pattern as large as I want. Okay, so this is one way of doing it. So I've kind of figured things out. Now I want to experiment. So the part of the algorithm of saying I want to find odd or even and kind of reduce the amount of code that I have. Let me see if I can figure that out. So with this one's a little bit different. It takes some fudging with the numbers, but we'll try to kind of run through the ID here as well. Again, I've had to make some changes in the grid size, so I did the 40 and only the 20 just to reduce the amount of vertical update to try to keep the lines a little bit tighter together. And in this one I've done it with one loop, and I'm just determining what rows are odd and which rows are even. And the big thing in here that you probably have not seen before, it's another sort of arithmetic idea, is this percentage sign here is modulo, and what it does is essentially takes two values, it divides them, and it will return back whatever the remainder is. So for me, if it comes back with essentially 0, it's an even number. If I divide it by 2, if it comes back with a remainder of 1, then I know it's an odd number. So I do this if statement here. I'm looking if the row numbers, that was another variable I had to initialize here, is that I'm starting with 1. So the first row is going to be odd. So I check for that. So divided by 2, if it's equal to 1, meaning that's odd. I'm adjusting the stroke weight here just so I can see it. And I'm creating this line, and this is all very similar to the past example. So I'm starting at the X and Y position, and I'm just adding X in a positive direction, Y in a negative direction, and getting my line created that way. So that's that sort of left to right leaning line. And I'm just doing some error checking here. I'm just printing to make sure that this if statement is catching the values that I'm looking for. So I'm just using this as sort of an error checking, and then I'm printing the actual value of X with inside of those. So that's looking for the odd, and if it's not odd, then it's even. And so I just have an else statement here. I've reduced the stroke weight back down to 1, and I'm making another line here. And this is where it kind of gets a little kludgy with moving it in the, just to, I had to keep this as sort of the iterative process. I had to look at it, say, all right, this isn't working, I want it a little bit tighter, and start working with these numbers. Now the nice thing is that at least that 40s and 20s, they're all pretty consistent numbers, so I didn't get too crazy with stuff here. And this seems to work. So I have a 640, 480 window size, and it's nice with that additional stroke weight, just the difference in there. It kind of gives a little bit of a little bit more sort of embossing with it. And I'm able to create the pattern. So again, I have my angles here. I'm having these lines are lining up. Everything seems to be evenly spaced, and it's working. So this took a little bit of trial and error, going back, seeing the results, making updates, making changes, and of course that's all part of the iterative design process. Now at this point I could output this as a raster or a vector graphic. I could bring it into Photoshop. I can add it to another image and do some embossing effects, and I could start building a texture from it that way.